The Indian Massacre of 1622 stands as one of the most dramatic and tragic episodes in the early history of the Virginia colony, marking a significant turning point in the relationship between European settlers and Native American tribes. The massacre, orchestrated by the Powhatan Confederacy under the leadership of Opkonakano, was a meticulously planned and executed attack that left a profound impact on both the immediate and long-term dynamics of colonial expansion in North America. The Powhatan Confederacy, a powerful alliance of indigenous tribes led by Chief Powhatan, circa 1545 to 1618, had initially engaged in a period of tentative peace with the English settlers following the end of the First Powhatan War in 1614. This era of relative tranquility saw a degree of cooperation and mutual benefit, with trade agreements established and cultural exchanges taking place. The colonists and the Powhatan people engaged in a complex relationship of diplomacy, trade, and occasional hostility. Native Americans were frequently welcomed into English homes, and settlers were invited into Powhatan villages, fostering a fragile but functional coexistence. However, this peace was undermined by the relentless expansion of English settlements. Beginning in 1610, English colonists had spread out from their initial settlement at Jamestown, encroaching upon Powhatan lands and resources. The colonists' expansion was marked by aggressive land acquisitions, theft of resources, and the destruction of sacred sites. Livestock, allowed to roam freely, trampled over Powhatan crops and disrupted their agricultural practices. This encroachment not only deprived the Powhatan Confederacy of their traditional lands, but also ignited tensions between the two groups. Opkonakano, the brother of the deceased Powhatan leader, emerged as the primary architect of the 1622 massacre. His leadership was marked by a strategic acumen and a profound understanding of both the strengths and vulnerabilities of the English settlers. His approach was shaped by the realization that the growing colonial presence threatened the survival and autonomy of his people. The massacre was not a spontaneous act of violence, but a carefully orchestrated military campaign designed to achieve multiple objectives. The attack was executed with a high degree of precision and coordination. On March 22, 1622, a coordinated assault was launched against the English settlements, targeting several key areas. The Powhatan Confederacy's forces, employing guerrilla tactics and exploiting the element of surprise, inflicted significant casualties. The attack resulted in the deaths of 347 English colonists, with the majority of the fatalities occurring before noon. The settlers, unprepared for such a coordinated and ruthless assault, suffered devastating losses, and the aftermath was marked by a protracted struggle for survival. The immediate consequences of the massacre were dire. In addition to the casualties, the destruction of crops and homes led to widespread malnutrition and starvation among the surviving colonists. The subsequent months saw the spread of disease, further exacerbating the settlers' suffering. The loss of food supplies and the disruption of daily life created a severe humanitarian crisis, with many colonists struggling to rebuild their lives in the wake of the devastation. The massacre achieved its primary objectives of demonstrating the military might of the Powhatan Confederacy and demoralizing the English colonists. Opkonakano sought to send a powerful message. The Powhatan Confederacy was a formidable adversary capable of challenging the colonial expansion and asserting its dominance. By striking at the heart of the English settlements, he aimed to force the colonists to reconsider their presence in Virginia and consider returning to England. However, the massacre did not lead to the desired outcome of driving the English away. Instead, the attack galvanized the colonists and prompted them to fortify their positions and intensify their efforts to resist and retaliate. The Second Powhatan War, 1622 to 1626, ensued as the colonists engaged in a determined campaign to reclaim their territories and reassert their control. The war saw a series of violent engagements, with the English gradually gaining the upper hand and achieving a military victory. In the aftermath of the Second Powhatan War, the colonial government adopted policies that further marginalized and restricted the Powhatan people. Trade with certain tribes was discouraged, and more land was appropriated for the expansion of tobacco plantations, which became a central economic driver for the colony. The impact of the massacre and subsequent conflicts laid the groundwork for the reservation system and the systematic displacement of Native American tribes in the region. Opconacano, undeterred by the defeat in the Second Powhatan War, launched another offensive in 1644. This led to the Third Powhatan War, 1644 to 1646, a final attempt to resist the encroachment of English settlers. The conflict ended with Opconacano's capture and execution, and the Treaty of 1646 marked the dissolution of the Powhatan Confederacy. The treaty imposed harsh terms on the Powhatan people, leading to further loss of land and autonomy. The legacy of the Indian Massacre of 1622 extended beyond the immediate context of Virginia. The massacre influenced English colonial policies and military strategies in subsequent conflicts, including the Pequot War, 1636 to 1638, and King Philip's War, 1675 to 1678, in New England. The patterns of violence, displacement, and cultural clash established during these early conflicts would shape the broader trajectory of Anglo-Native relations in North America. In summary, the Indian Massacre of 1622 was a pivotal event in the history of colonial America, representing a dramatic and violent confrontation between European settlers and Native American tribes. The massacre highlighted the complexities and tensions of early colonial interactions, underscoring the profound impact of expansionist policies on indigenous communities. The consequences of the massacre reverberated through subsequent conflicts and policies, shaping the course of American history and the evolving relationship between colonists and Native Americans. Jamestown and Powhatan Confederacy, the Jamestown Colony of Virginia, was established by the English in 1607 and fairly quickly came into conflict with the native tribes of the Powhatan Confederacy. These tribes had lived on the land which they knew as Tsinnecomica, densely populated land, for thousands of years, establishing cultural traditions linked to the area. The Spanish arrived in the West Indies in 1492 and then colonized South and Central America, extending their reach up through the modern-day state of Florida and laying further claim to the North American East Coast up to present-day New York State. They had not colonized above Florida, however, and limited themselves to raids along the coast, kidnapping natives to sell into slavery. Relations were strained by the colonists' continued abuse of the natives through theft of land and food. The English, who were late in their colonization efforts in the so-called New World, established their Roanoke colony in 1585 and again in 1587 in Virginia, but it did not survive past 1590. The natives, therefore, were already acquainted with Europeans by 1607, and the experiences had been far from pleasant. The Powhatan Confederacy, led by Chief Powhatan, also known as Wahansenica, L.C. 1547 c. 1618, did not mind the English at first because they had chosen a swamp of unusable land for their settlement, and further thought the English might serve as allies against the Spanish and other hostile tribes. Chief Powhatan, therefore, ordered his people to supply the ill-equipped and inept colonists with food and supplies. The colonists came to expect this type of service rather than learning to fend for themselves. Captain John Smith L. 1580 to 1631 established a good working relationship with Chief Powhatan in 1607, but by 1609, this was strained by the colonists' continued abuse of the natives through theft of land and food. Smith himself, in spite of his earlier efforts to befriend the tribes, eventually participated in food theft himself and left the colony for England in October 1609 without informing Chief Powhatan of his departure. After Smith was gone, the colonists took more food and occupied more land outside of Jamestown, as they considered the natives to be subjects of the English king, as they were themselves. These actions led Chief Powhatan to order them inside their settlement and to give his warriors leave to kill anyone found outside the fortifications. Powhatan's decree contributed to what is known as the starving time in Jamestown's history, during which over 80% of the colonists died. In May of 1610, a new governor, Sir Thomas Gates, L. circa 1585 to 1622, arrived and, shortly after him, the aristocrat Thomas West, Lord de La Warrell, 1577 to 1618. West rejected Smith's earlier approach in dealing with the natives and instituted a policy of no compromise which set off the First Powhatan War 1610 to 1614, a series of guerrilla strikes and counterstrikes killing many on both sides. Peace of Pocahontas, the natives were better guerrilla fighters and their weapons of the bow and arrow more effective than the colonists' muskets, which took more time to reload than it took a native archer to notch another arrow. The colonists, however, had a seemingly infinite supply of people who kept arriving to replace those who had been killed, while the tribes of the Confederacy lacked this luxury. The colonists also continually displaced the natives by attacking a village, killing the people, and fortifying it, thereby depriving native populations of land and resources they were using in the war and enlarging the buffer zone between English settlements and native villages. While the war raged on, more and more colonists arrived with more muskets and cannons, and settlements were established further inland. One of the colonists who had arrived in May of 1610 with Gates was John Rolfe, L. 1585 to 1622, who came with some hybrid tobacco seeds which he experimented with and planted. His tobacco became the most lucrative cash crop of the colony, and by 1614, he was a wealthy man with a large plantation across the river from the Henricus colony north of Jamestown. West fell ill in 1613 and returned to England after turning his authority over to Sir Samuel Argall, L. circa 1580 to 1626, who continued his policies. That same year, Argall kidnapped Pocahontas, L. circa 1596 to 1617, daughter of Chief Powhatan, holding her for ransom at Henricus. Chief Powhatan agreed to the terms of her release and sent Argall the tools, weapons, and prisoners requested, but Argall claimed he had not honored the deal and kept Pocahontas. She converted to Christianity, taking the name Rebecca, and married John Rolfe in April 1614. Chief Powhatan and the colonial authorities both approved of the union, and so ended the First Powhatan War. The 8 years that followed became known as the Peace of Pocahontas, during which trade between the colonists and natives flourished and land transactions were, for the most part, approved by both sides. Lead up to the Massacre of Pocahontas, Rolfe and their young son, Thomas Rolfe L. 1615 c. 1680, left for England on a promotional tour to generate further investment in the colony in 1616. Pocahontas died in 1617 as they were on their way back to Virginia, and Thomas was left in the care of Rolfe's brother in England. Chief Powhatan kept the peace in honor of his grandson, but stepped down as chief shortly after his daughter's death. His brother, Apichatpam, then became chief, but he was not as powerful or popular among the tribes as Chief Powhatan's half-brother, Opkonakano. Opkonakano became Chief Powhatan, and Wahunsinica died shortly afterwards, sometime in 1618. When Pocahontas had gone to England, Wahunsinica had sent along a number of her family and tribal members, including her brother-in-law Tamakomo, who was also one of his sages and counselors. Tamakomo was to observe the English in their own land and return with a report. According to colonial English accounts, Tamakomo criticized the English harshly before a council of the elders and chiefs, but was shamed into silence by a colonial delegation which countered his claims that the English could not be trusted. These accounts are suspect, however, as they were written by colonists, who, in fact, could not be trusted, justifying later atrocities committed against the natives. Opkonakano seems to have accepted Tamakomo's words as truth and planned accordingly. The Peace of Pocahontas still held in 1619, and the trade agreements had encouraged friendly relations between the immigrants and the indigenous tribes. In 1611, when Henricus had been established by Sir Thomas Dale, L. circa 1560 to 1619, the first college in North America was founded close by for the purpose of educating Native American youth in Christianity and European culture. Pocahontas' conversion had encouraged the hope that more natives would follow her example, and more effort was put into evangelizing the natives. John Gadsby Chapman, Public Domain. Opkonakano took advantage of these efforts, encouraging his people to show more interest in conversion, and he led by example in doing so himself, which led the colonists to believe further in the peaceful intentions of the tribes. The records of the Virginia Company, the group who had funded the 1607 Jamestown expedition and still controlled the colony, make clear that in 1621, relations between colonists and natives were considered better than ever. The report, written after the massacre, describes the period leading up to it. Word was received from Opkanakano that he held the peace concluded so firm as the sky should sooner fall than it dissolve. Yeah, such was the treacherous dissimulation of that people who then had contrived our destruction, that even 2 days before the massacre, some of our men were guided through the woods by them in safety, and many the like passages, rather increasing our former confidence than in any wise ministering the least suspicion of the breach of the peace or of what instantly ensued. Yeah, they borrowed our own boats to convey themselves across the river to consult of the devilish murder that ensued and of our utter extirpation, which God of his mercy prevented. 550. John Rolfe had remarried by this time and was back at his plantation, making regular trips across the river to Henricus. The House of Burgesses, first established in 1619, had made it their first order of business to address a wrong committed against Native Americans by a wealthy landowner. In 1621, Opkanakano's war chief, Namadanu, died in 1621, was killed by the colonists after he was accused of killing one of their own and taking his clothes. Opkanakano took no action, claiming his man had been justly killed, though whether he meant this is debated, and letting the event go. The massacre at about that same time, he and his brother Apichatpam wore names in preparation for the attack and called on the tribes to participate in a ceremony honoring the life of Wahunsinkah. This event stirred no suspicion among the colonists at the time, but later, they came to believe this was a pretense under which Chief Powhatan was able to bring all the tribal chiefs together to coordinate the assault. At this time, it was later surmised the natives gathered intelligence on where certain colonists would be in various settlements, who would be working in the fields at what time, how long the full-scale attack would take to complete, etc. The morning of March 22nd, 1622, Good Friday, began as any other with the colonists going to work on their farms and in their shops. Scholar Charles C. Mann describes the events which followed. Early that morning, Indians slipped into European settlements, knocking on doors and asking to be let in. Most were familiar visitors. They came unarmed. Many accepted a meal or a drink. Then they seized whatever implement came to hand, kitchen knife, heavy stew pot, the colonists' own guns, and killed everyone in the house. The assault was brutal, widespread, and well-planned. So swift were the blows that many colonists died without knowing they were under attack. Entire families fell. Houses burned across what had been Senecamoco. At the last minute, several Indians told English friends about the attack, providing enough warning to let Jamestown gather its defenses. Nonetheless, the attackers killed at least 325 people. 89. The number killed is hard to determine, but is usually given as 347. The college, hospital, and colony of Henricus were completely destroyed, and all the inhabitants killed, including, presumably, John Rolfe. Settlements burned all across the region, and the surviving colonists were stunned into inaction. They had grown used to small conflicts breaking out which were quickly resolved. None of them could conceive of what they had just experienced. Aftermath and response. Opkanakano hoped that the response would take the form of the colonists' swift departure from his lands, but he had misjudged his opponent. At this point, Opkanakano could have easily finished the survivors off. Those outside of Jamestown would have been easy enough to kill as they had no defenses, and Jamestown could have been set on fire with fleeing colonists then killed as they tried to escape. Instead, he did nothing but wait for a response. It was his hope that this response would take the form of the colonists' swift departure from his lands, which he believed was what a Native American tribe would do. But he had misjudged his opponent. The colonists began to regroup and rebuild and traded again with the tribes that had attacked them. They actually had little choice, however, as their own crops had been burned. Mann comments, the aftermath of the massacre claimed as many as 700 more lives. Because the attack disrupted spring planting, the colonists grew even less maize than usual. Meanwhile, the Virginia Company tried to rebuild Jamestown by sending over 1,000 new colonists. Incredibly, they came to Virginia with no food supplies. Reinforcements could not help against the guerrilla tactics of the natives in the Second Powhatan War, however, and so the colonists resorted to trickery. They called for a peace conference at which they poisoned the wine and, once the chiefs had fallen, attacked their bodyguards and attendants, killing over 200 of them. The war continued until Opkonakano sued for peace in 1626, but hostilities went on through 1629 and into the 1630s in some areas. Conclusion news of the massacre had reached England by June of 1622, and King James I of England, r. 1603 to 1625, was outraged. He dissolved the Virginia Company and took direct control of the colony through a royal charter, claiming he was better able to protect the colonists than the company had been. Whether James I actually meant this is unknown. It is just as likely he wanted direct control of the profitable tobacco exports from the colonies. On March 22, 1624, the House of Burgesses convened and passed the decree that March 22 be solemnized as a holiday to commemorate the massacre, in making the date a solemn holiday, during which the events of the massacre would be recounted. The colonists ensured that new arrivals would experience it through first-hand accounts of those who had lived it, and then through stories based on those accounts. The animosity between the colonists and the indigenous tribes worsened as the stories of the massacre of 1622 were told and retold. These accounts were added after Opkonakano launched another attack in 1644, killing over 500 colonists and starting the Third Powhatan War. This conflict ended in 1646 with the capture of the chief and his assassination by a prison guard who shot him in the back. When the Pequot War broke out in New England in 1636, or King Philip's War in 1675, the savagery of the colonists' attacks was informed, in part by the stories of the Indian Massacre at Virginia of 1622. The natives were considered dangerous and untrustworthy, capable of vast levels of deception, and eager to kill defenseless English men, women, and children. Actually, the natives had only learned from the English how to hone their arts of deception and trickery. The massacre of 1622 was not, as the colonists characterized it, the act of ungrateful savages who had only benefited from Christian kindness and English courtesy. It was a carefully planned and executed response to years of abuse and theft by self-righteous, land-greedy, racist English colonists who cared nothing for the souls of the natives they claimed to pray for and, by their own accounts, considered them barely human. By 1622, the colonists had already committed enough atrocities against the natives to warrant such a response. By the end of the 17th century, they had committed even more, but still justified their theft of even more Native American land and the slaughter of indigenous tribes by invoking the Indian Massacre of 1622.